Hi, I am Dr. David Reinstein, and I thought I'd change things up a little bit and record a socially distanced video in my nice slash parking lot slash backyard. And I wanted to not be so strange, so I invited Tom Morgan, a student, to come join me, and hopefully we'll be able to have nice interactions that will make the material sort of a little bit more interactive and less, and he'll sort of slow me down and stop me and ask good questions. So the first thing I wanted to record a video on was the motivating exercise that we might sometimes do in lecture. And what I am trying to do here is give you some background, give you some context, or not, maybe context is the wrong word, but give you some explanation of what sort of considerations are we making when we talk about preferences, and why are we doing all of this, and preferences and choices. Why are we doing all of this very abstract formal stuff? And I thought a motivating exercise was the following. Okay, consider a decision you recently made. What sort of choice have you had to recently make between two things where you couldn't actually have both? The path forked. You had to go for one thing or another. So what was think about what was the decision? Can you define that clearly? And what were the options? Tom, do you have an example in mind? Sorry, I should have told you I was going to
yeah, that's
put you on the spot here.
To walk the cycle here?
Oh, that's a great one. Okay, so walk here or cycle here. Now those were two options. So Tom came to my parking lot from, I guess, somewhere across town in Exeter. Yeah. Those weren't those were mutually exclusive. You couldn't both walk and cycle here. But there were other options you could have chosen among. But I suppose those two were the top two under consideration. Okay, so how do you think you decided? How do you think you decided among those options? Now we're getting a bit psychological.
Kind of a trade-off, I suppose, between mainly focused on speed. Like, walk here would be quite nice and relaxed, where I could spend 10 minutes at home.
Okay, so it was okay. I see. So it was a savings of time. You would have more leisure time if you took the cycle here, more time in the morning. But then the time you spent here maybe was a little bit less relaxing if you took the cycle rather than walking here. So you weighed. I guess there was more than one sort of feature that went into that decision. One element could have been leisure time drinking tea. Another element could have been enjoyment of the journey here.
Yeah.
There probably were other things that could have weighed into it too, right? There was some possibility that if you cycled here, your bicycle would run a flat tire, you'd hit a nail. So you were trading among these different bundles of options in this decision. I like that. Okay. So you decided to cycle here. I don't know if your cycle's in the frame. I assume you did, unless you walked the cycle here. Okay. How do you think you decided that how do you think that you decided that it was worth it to cycle here, that it was worth it to save the time at the cost of maybe a slightly less leisurely journey? And maybe if you want to come into, well, let's let the train go by, and then maybe just come into frame. I'm just going to check the video while you're doing that.
That's okay. Yeah, that's the question.
So the question is, how do you think you made the decision? What were you decided to cycle here? How did that win out?
I suppose the leisure of a cup of tea is quite a nice, I'm aware of that and how much it benefits me. So I did look out the window and see it was nice weather, so it would have been all right, like not a huge hassle.
So it would have cycled, I suppose, right?
Yeah, so it's cycle.
No, that's it. So one thing to think about is, do you think you made the decision at the time? We'll get into this perhaps later in the module. Were you a little bit perhaps present biased? Were you thinking, if I, it might be annoying in the long run to have to park the bicycle, but right now I can enjoy the tea. Why don't we get those notes that are blown away? So action pack this. So
yeah, I suppose
we could have, right? We all think, let me stay in bed 5 more minutes. That's the caricature.
Yeah.
So it could be that maybe though, even though you did make the decision weighing the options, it could be that we don't know that you made the best decision in retrospect.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
we don't know that. We know we're going to talk about preferences between different choices, and we're going to assume that the person will chose the thing that they actually rank the highest and actually, in some conceptions of this, actually enjoy the most. But it could be that this option here is chosen in favor of this option here. And that's what this one thing this book does, is separate preferences from choices. It's not saying we necessarily will choose the option that we end up enjoying the most, although that will be the assumption for most of the course. Okay, this is getting very nice and interesting. I like your example. Okay, do you think other people in your place would have made the same decision?
No, probably not. A lot of people don't like cycle on the road and stuff.
Preferences vary, right? So someone with the same set of choices or the same constraints might have made a different choice because they may have had different, preferences, utility functions, perhaps. If you were to get amnesia, a condition where you don't remember the past, and you were back in the same position, do you think you'd make the same decision? How many times out of 10 would you make the same decision?
I probably would. I know, yeah. Like having leisure time at home is probably preferable in most scenarios, but...
Well, I'm saying the exact same scenario.
Oh, yeah, okay.
You
Yeah,
think
sure.
every time that we've all seen these movies where the person, wasn't there that movie where the guy forgets the last 5 minutes, or...
Yeah.
And then you can also see videos of people with this tragic condition where they forget their last minute or two, and they're asked the same question. They end up going to this loop.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I'm going off piste here.
Yeah, no, I get the idea.
But
yeah, I think I probably would, I suppose. Like, yeah,
Okay.
to your reward.
Okay, maybe 9 times out of 10. So
Yeah,
you're pretty
that's fine.
consistent. You think your preferences are pretty consistent. Okay. Now, why would we care about this stuff? Well, as policymakers may want to know what governs people's choices, and this is actually a pretty reasonable one. They might more likely care about your choice of cycling versus driving. But also people in business might want to know what's driving people's choices, and how does it change in our policies, our prices, et cetera? How will that influence it? And they'll be building perhaps models using data. Sorry, I'm as if I'm something here. Models using data of people's choices, and want to think, okay, well, what are reasonable restrictions to put in these models? Okay, now I said, can you think of any rule that governs how people do make decisions? Okay, someone comes from way up there, lands, and says, okay, I need to know how people make decisions. I want to know something informative about human behavior. Like, we can say informative things about animal behavior. We know what happens when objects are under the influence of gravity. They fall. What about human behavior? I want this to be informative. I want it to rule out some choices, and I want it to be predictive in the sense that people rarely violate this rule. Would you have any thoughts on what a sort of reasonable rule that might seem obvious to us, but not to this space?
Like, people do what they enjoy, like some kind of pleasure-seeking rule, probably.
Okay, a pleasure-seeking rule. So let's think about that. Does that rule anything out? Does this have any, any whatever we want to? I'm forgetting the word, but does this have any falsifiability? Does it rule out any decisions? You'd say no one would ever do that, or people would rarely do that.
Yeah, probably wouldn't throw myself off a bridge just randomly
Okay.
on the basis it would hurt and stuff.
Okay, well that sounds like a survival thing too, but okay, fair point. So people would not do something that they expect would hurt them.
Yeah.
Although, our models won't even say that people won't. If you look in the OR text, the Osborne and Rubinstein text, they won't say. They even say, okay, it's possible that these preferences value pain. We haven't restricted that. But okay, yeah, that seems like a reasonable thing. People won't do things that maybe biologically bring them negative stimuli.
Yeah.
Okay, and now I suppose I asked a similar question. State a rule that governs how people should make decisions. And by should, I don't mean necessarily in a moral sense. I mean, if you were following this rule, you won't regret having made decisions in this way. maybe think of something more general.
If like two actions yield the same benefit, don't pick the one that has more costs.
Okay, if two actions, that's a nice one. Don't pick the one that has more costs. And by costs, what exactly do we mean?
Things that I suppose are negative due to people, or meaning we have to spend more time trying to achieve the same utility.
Okay, one thing is it could cost us more time, but in general, when economists talk about costs, we talk about giving up of other things that we enjoy, which if I reverse spending more time, I could say leisure time.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Okay, okay, so basically, a lot of this exercise that we're going to be doing surrounds questions like these and trying to come up with a set of what are some reasonable rules we could come up with that most of us would accept seem to be, a good governing point for most individuals' behavior. And then say from those rules, what would it imply? What can we take those axioms, like people will choose more rather than less? It is in a sense what you're saying. If that were the case, what would be the equivalent mathematical statement? And we'll see that, for instance, if people choose more rather than less, if we think about a budget set,
I meant to say
always choose
at the
point
frontier of their budget
on
set
their budget set,
or
or
on their
over
budget line.
lifetime spending all of their income. Okay, and I have some more philosophical discussion of this in the text or in the web book, which is linked at the ELE. So we want to develop a model that can show how we make choices or decisions. It's going to be governed. The neoclassical model will talk about preferences and constraints. And in fact, a lot of this may seem rather obvious, but then I think one interesting thing about doing this very formally and clearly is that we're able to then bring this to situations where it's not so obvious how to express choices and preferences. So we'll talk about group preferences and social preferences. We'll talk about people that seem to be making inconsistent decisions. When I get back to group and social preferences, we can think about things like, what is my preferences for how many individuals should exist on the earth? What's a reasonable way of what would be a reasonable and consistent way of coming up with this is a reasonable preferences for how many people should be on the earth versus how many happy people. So that gets at the issues of sort of altruistic preferences and population ethics. It's also going to be, in fact, the approaches that we take will actually be in contrast to approaches that are taken. Have you heard of sort of machine learning and tree modeling and maybe not tree modeling, but big data?
But yeah.